Thank you. Well, that was a very kind introduction, Dr. Poole, and it fits in exactly as I would expect with all of the kind welcoming I've received since arriving here a couple of days ago. I've just been overwhelmed by the welcome. So thank you so much to everyone that I've met and to everyone that I will meet. It's a special place. You can tell that right away. The introduction by Dr. Poole really covers a couple of my first slides, so that's great. Save me some time and save all of you some time. The title of my talk is FDA Device Regulation at the Intersection of Safety and Innovation. And I'm going to be, for better or worse, going to be touching on some really big ideas, all of which I think are like super interesting. So my email address will pop up here eventually, and I would love to talk with any of you via email afterwards if you find any of this interesting. And I hope that we'll still have some time for questions that we can go through some of these ideas. I think this is a really exciting place for cardiovascular medicine. I think that it's one of the new frontiers. You can't see this yet. I have no industry disclosures, but I am a special government employee by the FDA. So those are my disclosures. This is an introductory slide, which really has been covered by Dr. Poole, but the highlights being that I did spend some time at the FDA as an employee of the FDA, and during which time I reviewed applications for devices from industry as well as protocols to study devices either off-label or pre-market by physician investigators. When I was at the FDA, I met, I met some of truly the most conscientious, hardworking, smart scientists and physicians that I've ever met. I thoroughly enjoyed working with them, and that's really what inspired me to continue my relationships with them after I left. And the only thing that Dr. Poole didn't mention that I think is worth mentioning here is that I was raised in a physician family, and that's really what inspired me to pursue medicine in the first place, and I'm so glad that I did. Here's a case, and I think this will be a familiar story to many of you. So consider this patient who you probably saw yesterday or last week or will see tomorrow. This is a 65-year-old woman with an ischemic cardiomyopathy with a low EF, and she's on maximal beta blocker and ACE inhibitor. She has class 2 symptoms and no history of VT or VF. She had an ICD, a dual chamber ICD, placed in 2005. The RV lead that was chosen was a Riata lead. With a dual coil Riata lead, which for those of you who don't know was a lead manufactured by St. Jude in the 2000s. She came to the emergency department in 2010 with repeated inappropriate shocks from failure of her Riata lead. The failure mechanism at the time was recognized to be cable externalization, where the conductor cables were actually extruded from the lead body, causing it to deliver inappropriate shocks. She was admitted to the hospital. She underwent a workup for a few other things. She was, after the tachytherapies, of course, were disabled, and she was noted to have a wide left bundle branch block. When coronary disease was ruled out, it was decided that she should undergo upgrade to a CRT-D device. So her Riata lead was abandoned and capped, and a new RV lead was placed, along with an LV lead. And unfortunately, in 2016, she came back to the emergency department with her new RV lead fractured and dysfunctional. So, terrible situation. What do we do now? You know, I'm sure many of you are thinking what you might do, how you might manage this patient. But I want us to think a little bit beyond that. Besides managing the patient in front of you, what do we do with these data? There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of issues with this device, with this patient's experience with the device, her interaction with the people implanting the device. How do we make sure that her experience counts? How do we make sure that what she went through matters for patients like her in the future? I think I'll convince you that we can do that. In order to do that, I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page about device regulation, which tends to be a paradigm that people are not familiar with. I'm not going to go through this long timeline. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. Number one, that really nothing was regulated until there were these terrible catastrophes in the early 1900s, which established the FDA. But it wasn't until the 1970s that devices were identified as really a separate entity and began being regulated separately in sort of a parallel paradigm. This established the idea of safety and effectiveness, that devices had to demonstrate that they were safe and effective, which is different than in Europe, where they really need only be demonstrated to be safe, but they had to be safe and effective. And then in 1997, this was further revised, that devices had to achieve this standard of safety and effectiveness via the least burdensome approach. What is the most efficient way to demonstrate this standard? And then in 2002, the FDA said, Congress said, industry needs to have some skin in the game. We're going to start charging you to use these regulatory resources. There were a lot of reasons behind this, as you might imagine. It's quite political, I'm told. But it is, one of the benefits of this is it does isolate or protect the FDA from the ebbs and flows of federal funding, which we're all acutely aware of, I'm sure. And then I'm just going to mention really briefly the 21st Century Cures, which was legislation passed in 2016, which is really interesting and remains to be seen how it will be implemented, but suffice it to say that in the world of devices, there is likely to be big changes, or at least small changes, in the types of data which are acceptable for device approval. So stay tuned for that. But you might ask, well, why did device regulation develop in parallel to drugs? What is so different about them that they have to be regulated in a different way? These are a few of the reasons, I think, that why that's the case. First of all, if you do a study of devices, it's really difficult to blind patients in particular. You can do a sham procedure, and that certainly is done sometimes, but you can imagine the logistical and sometimes ethical challenges with that. In vitro testing can be more effective with devices compared with drugs. There are known failure mechanisms of devices, and so you can test devices on the bench to failure and understand how hard and how long you have to push to achieve failure, which is, again, different from drugs. And also, devices are developed in an iterative way, unlike drugs. So there can be small changes to one component of a device or the delivery mechanism of a device, which doesn't fundamentally change it. So a whole new approval process isn't necessary, but that iterative process is, of course, different, and does lead to some questions about, well, how many iterative changes mean that you have a new device? When does an old device become a new device? And that's something that we struggle with quite a bit. Also, device developers tend to come from small groups, sort of the quintessential garage lab, people working in a garage in small groups developing devices. So that, of course, changes the resources available to conduct large clinical trials like we're used to with drugs. And then finally, the impact of the operator. So when you prescribe a drug, it's swallowed or injected or inhaled or whatever, but there's really just one way to administer it. When it comes to devices, it matters the way that stent was deployed in the coronary artery. It matters the way that ablation catheter is used, and so that does complicate the way clinical trials are conducted for devices. Also, devices are regulated based on risk, and this is a really important idea. The least risky devices, your toothbrush, is regulated by the FDA, but only really in regard to how it's manufactured. It's these second and third group risk devices. These are the much riskier devices. They have impact on more impact on safety. And so in order to study these devices, you need what's called an investigational device exemption, and to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. And once you've done that, then a device can be cleared through the 510K pathway, which just means that you've demonstrated that it's substantially equivalent to an existing device. But the PMA devices are the ones that I find most interesting. These are the riskiest devices with the most impact on patient safety and the most ability to change patients' experience and morbidity and mortality. And these devices go through a very rigorous evaluation process at the FDA, almost always including at least one IDE trial. Okay, so it's a lot of background. I hope you're still with me. I'm just going to remind you of this idea of the least burdensome approach. And this was defined as the most appropriate investment of time, effort, and resources on the part of industry and FDA. So how do we get to where we want to be as fast and as cheaply as possible? Well, you can imagine that that's a moving target. It's vague. So how do we achieve that? And it's also the reason why there are varying arguments. People or industry who say that the FDA is way too restrictive and the FDA is holding back innovation by being too restrictive. And then the other end of the spectrum, there are people who say, sometimes in the clinical community or patient safety community, say the FDA is way too permissive, letting all this crap onto the market that shouldn't be there and it's not safe for patients. I think I can convince you of both. So as you remember, our patient had a Riata lead, and she had problems with her Riata lead. You might ask, well, what happened when that device was studied before it was available to implant in a patient? Is the balance favoring innovation here? Was the FDA being too permissive letting that device on the market? Well, maybe. The Riata lead, I don't know if this is projecting well, but the Riata lead was approved in 2002 as a supplement, which means it's kind of like an amendment to an existing device that was approved almost a decade earlier. And honestly, the two devices are almost unrecognizable. They don't share many of the qualities. And so it wasn't tested. It wasn't tested in human clinical testing prior to being approved by the FDA. And so this novel failure mechanism of cable externalization was recognized clinically. And these reports were made to the FDA, and there was some reporting in the literature. But it wasn't until there started to be a critical mass of these reports that the FDA decided to decided to issue a Class 1 recall. And this happened while I was at the FDA, and I can assure you there was tremendous hand-wringing about this. It was not taken lightly. The people making this decision understood that this was would have tremendous impact on patients who would then have to be managed with this scary thing happening to their device, and also that to the company who made this device, this was a tremendous financial issue for them. So it really wasn't taken lightly. In addition, there was a lot of hand-wringing because, all right, well, this lead has failed, but what do? We don't even know what the rate of failure mechanism, we don't know the rate of this failure. We're not studying it. We're not measuring it. How do we even know what the rate is? What do we tell people to do? And after much discussion with external experts, the decision was made to recommend routine surveillance of these leads with fluoroscopy. There was a lot of discussion in the clinical community about whether that made any sense at all, but it was done by a number of groups. But while St. Jude was required to do a study to actually measure this rate of failure, while that was ongoing, there were a lot of groups in hospitals and medical systems who took it upon themselves to try and measure this. And so this is just a picture of, this is a Riata lead that I removed a couple of months ago, and maybe you can see at the red arrow cable externalization. This is the novel failure mechanism. And in the red circle, this is the coil in the RV lead that is covered in fibrotic tissue. So managing these Riata leads is not trivial. Can have significant risk to the patient if you make a decision to remove it. And so with some colleagues, we thought this was a big enough concern that we needed to have better information. We needed to know what was the risk of failure and how can we use those data to inform our decision making with patients. So we did a couple of analyses. In the first, we did a meta-analysis. There were 23 reports of prospective surveillance the way the FDA had recommended. We meta-analyzed those data and found that there was almost a 1 in 4 risk of cable externalization, which is pretty incredible, and that there was a 6% risk of electrical failure of these leads, which is completely unacceptable for a modern ICD lead. And then we used those data to inform our decision analysis. So we modeled all the different decisions, all the different scenarios where when a decision is made to revise the lead, meaning you decided to replace it either with removing the old one or leaving it in place, and what were the differences and outcomes if you did that. Our meta-analysis results informed this decision analysis, and I'll spare you the nitty-gritty details. It doesn't matter. So mortality really was no different between the two strategies, which is not great when you're trying to publish a paper, but it is great when you're talking to your patient about what the options are. This is a super busy slide, and I'm not going to read it, and I don't expect you to either, but I put it up here to say that there have been a number of groups who have examined the publicly available data that on the FDA website that characterizes the data that was used to support device approvals and clearances. So all of that information is publicly available. There have been groups who've looked at the data that was used for PMAs, for 510Ks, and for different types of PMAs. And in summary, I can tell you there are 2 lessons learned. Number 1 is that The data supporting FDA decisions is imperfect. It's imperfect. There are ways to improve it. And number two, if you use the publicly available databases from the FDA, you can get published in JAMA. These are all from JAMA. So if you want to write a paper, let me know. We'll call JAMA. So I think that discussion supports the idea that the FDA has been too permissive, letting all this junk onto the market that doesn't belong there. But there is a counter argument, and it's a loud counter argument, mostly coming from the industry, saying that the FDA has shifted their balance in favor of safety, and they're not letting enough innovation onto the market. I think this crowd could probably teach me a whole lot about this topic. So this is one example of TAVR. So TAVR was available in the EU in 2007, but wasn't available in the US until 2011. And again, I was at the FDA when this was approved in 2011, and it was jubilation in the hallways. I kid you not. Everyone was so excited to approve it, but it doesn't change the fact that there was this 4-year gap between Europe and the US. Think about all the patients that you met in those years who maybe you could have helped with this device had it been available. So that's a real opportunity cost. And when the device was approved in 2011, it's not as if it opened some floodgates of approval for TAVR. There are 8 valves available in the world, but we only have 2. So, the industry would say that the FDA is being too restrictive in allowing devices onto the market. Another example, and Dr. Patton could probably teach us all a lot about this. She sat on the circulatory panel for this device, the left atrial appendage closure device, or Watchman. It was available in Europe in 2005, but it didn't even come to the circulatory panel until 2009. And Dr. Poole gave us a little idea of in the introduction about what the circulatory panel is, but it's a group of external experts like Dr. Patton who advise the FDA on particularly novel devices, and Watchman being one of those. So it came to panel in 2009. A lot of discussion. The panel was kind of split about what to do. So the FDA asked for more data. The device came back to panel in 2013 and again in 2014, and it wasn't actually approved until 2015. There's 10 years between Europe and the US. And think about what changed in AFib management in those 10 years. I mean, drugs were used differently, ablation was done differently, and I think most importantly, anticoagulation was done differently. So in the original studies, Watchman was compared to Coumadin. I don't think that's the right comparator anymore. Certainly not the way we manage. I've experienced managing AFib, and so because the FDA asked for all this additional data, perhaps they shot themselves in the foot because the data they got was obsolete by the time they had it. I think this also shows that they were too restrictive. They wanted too much information before they were willing to make a decision. And then from the financial literature, there's been a drastic or significant decline in seed stage funding for medical devices. It was like $300 million in 2009, and now it's $50 million in 2014. That's a really profound decrease. And the same can be said not just at the seed stage, but overall. There's been a significant decrease in medical device investment in the U.S. And there's also evidence to demonstrate that if devices are not studied early in the U.S., they're not available early in the U.S. There was a survey of dozens of medical device companies by the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which found that most medical device companies conduct their early feasibility studies exclusively outside the U.S. Exclusively. They won't even study them in the U.S. It's too hard. And when you ask them why, they say the number one reason was because of regulatory burden. Now, the FDA has tried to address this with an early feasibility study guidance document, but it's not going so well. There's not a whole lot of early feasibility study in the U.S. So I think I've demonstrated that FDA is too permissive, and I've demonstrated they're too restrictive. And you might ask yourself, if you've ever known a patient or taken care of a patient or been a patient, you might ask, well, what about patients? They're the ones getting this stuff. What do they think about all of this? And it turns out no one's ever really asked, which is too bad. But until now, so I have a couple of ongoing studies trying to get at this question, because if the FDA is trying to find this balance of innovation and safety, it would be nice to know what the people they serve believe about that. Because the FDA does have a public health mission, it would be reasonable to ask them. One of the projects is in its early stages. We're looking at, it's essentially a quality improvement project. How do we engage patients with more education in their device management? And stay tuned for results of that. It's ongoing. But the project I'm really excited about, we just finished enrollment a couple of weeks ago, and we did a survey study of device patients, asking them some questions about knowledge about the FDA and also their perceptions and opinions about it. Now, I think it would surprise nobody in this room that the patients know absolutely nothing about the way the FDA works. And I mean, I think if I asked doctors, I might get the same results, but there's no knowledge about how this works. But I think more interesting is highlighted in red. So 6% of the respondents believe that there's a country other than the US who does a better job at making innovative devices available. And 6%, a different 6% believe that a country other than the US does the best job of making patients safe. So patients think they have both. And maybe they do. Maybe they're not in conflict. Perhaps innovation and safety can be had together. We can have our cake and eat it too. I was going to put one of my kids on here, but this one's more attractive, so. Okay, so what do we, is this true? I mean, I think it is. I think we can have both innovation and safety. And I think that we can have that now, that it's a new era. We can do this now because of two big ideas. The first is this idea of balancing data collection in the pre and post market space. So we can't know every failure mechanism when a device is released. We can't expect to know that. But I think it's reasonable to expect that there is a robust and reliable way to collect those data once the device is available. We should be able to know what happens. We should know the numerator and denominator, and that was the problem with Riata. We just had no idea what was the numerator, what was the denominator, and we were playing catch up. We shouldn't have to do that. And the FDA is really acutely aware of this. This is a strategic priority for the Center for Devices, but rebalancing this data collection. And we can do this because of a revolution in the use of real-world evidence. Real-world evidence is what everyone here does every day. You see patients, you write notes, you enter data into registries, you do all kinds of things that generate data. We have the tools we need to use those data. Now, the real-world evidence draft guidance from the FDA is in draft form, but little birdie told me it'll be finalized really, really soon. So I think it's a really exciting time for those of us who care about, real-world evidence. So these two things together make it possible for us to really do better for our patients. This is how I sort of see the ocean that we swim in every day. There are data everywhere. But we can't drink it. And if you'll forgive the metaphor, we need to desalinate it. We have to be able to use these data in a way that makes sense. And I'm interested in regulatory process, and so I want to use these data for regulation, but there are so many applications for these data that would benefit patients and the clinical community in general. And I'm going to talk about just a couple of them. Actually, just one, I think. Registries. So there's a lot of excitement and a lot of experience using registries as a source of real-world evidence to inform the regulatory process. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Center for Medicare or Medicaid studies, except to say that they've played a role in using registries to collect real-world evidence. I don't totally understand coverage and reimbursement, and maybe somebody here can enlighten me, but they have played a role in this process, because through this coverage with evidence development idea, they can cover a device, they can reimburse the use of a device with the caveat that the data from that Medicare patient has to be entered into a registry. And that was the genesis of the NCDR-ICD registry, which certainly my EP colleagues are aware of, and probably many of you. That paradigm has been replicated a number of times, and a few times within cardiovascular devices with LVADs and TAVR and some other things. And it's been met with variable success, but I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned for sure. And one of those lessons is that we can do comparative effectiveness research from these registries of real-world evidence. One of the charges of the NCDR-ICD registry was to understand how ICDs worked in populations that were poorly represented in the landmark clinical, or not well represented in the landmark clinical trials establishing their benefit, one of those being women. And I'm going to walk you through an example. So like I said, women were not well represented in the landmark clinical trials of primary prevention ICDs, and so there really was insufficient power to understand the impact of this device on this group. And so along with some colleagues, we used data from the ICD registry of patients women who had an ICD, and we compared that to women from a different registry, the Get With the Guidelines registry, who were matched on like dozens of variables, and we looked at outcomes in the non-ICD patients and ICD patients. And luckily, I'm not sure we would have published it otherwise, but luckily we found that ICDs are beneficial, or there's associated mortality benefit in women with an ICD. And also lucky for us, we found that benefit is, and for all of our patients, we found that that benefit is similar to what's seen in men, which is good because the guidelines are, agnostic to sex. And so this reassured us that we were doing the right thing. And this was a study that, had you tried to randomize the study, take women and randomize them to primary prevention ICD or not, that would be a pretty thorny endeavor and an expensive one. And so this is sort of a way to get around that. Another way to use real-world evidence from registries for comparative effectiveness is the idea of, gets back to our issues with Riata. What do we do with leads that are non-functional? So when a lead's not infected and you need to revise it for some reason, do you abandon it and replace it, or do you extract it? And this is also a really thorny issue to study in a randomized way. There are so many intervening factors, comorbidities, operator experience. There's really so many things that go into this. It would be very hard to do a randomized trial. Not impossible, but very hard. And so in the interim, until such time as that's done, we took data from the NCDR ICD registry to examine this. And we, again, matched our patients using a sophisticated propensity score matching model. And we found that while there was no statistically significant difference in these strategies at the intermediate term, around 2 or 3 years, there did appear to be a trend, at least in the beginning, of better outcomes or better mortality in patients who underwent an abandonment procedure. A lot of caveats to this study, and I'd be happy to talk about it in more detail, but I bring it up to point out the fact that we can do these types of analyses because of the collection of real-world evidence in registries. So if you're like me, you're thinking, well, if we can look at comparative effectiveness based on strategies, perhaps we can look at comparative effectiveness based on device selection. And so that was the idea behind an ongoing project. We identified ICD generators that were undergoing Class 1 recall during the time of the ICD registry. And we looked back at them, and when a generator is replaced due to really any reason, the operator has to report a reason for replacing the generator. So we said, well, what did the operators say about why they replaced a generator? And we compared that to what does the FDA predict would be the reason that a device would have to be replaced because of the recall. And it turns out it's not great, that in some cases the agreement is only about 25%, and in other cases it's 100%. So certainly the way data are collected now in the ICD registry, it's probably not robust and reliable enough to be our canary in the coal mine when it comes to device failure. So that's data in the registries is of course collected prospectively, but we were asking a retrospective question. What if we had prospective data collection for prospective data, questions being asked? And that was the idea behind a joint effort to examine leadless pacemakers. I was honored to be on the circulatory panel during this discussion where all the leadless pacemaker manufacturers came to the table together. Those who, at the time, there was none available off protocol, but everyone who had one either in production or even thinking about doing it gathered to talk about what are the ways that we can share resources to study our device in the post-market space in order to improve efficiencies and reduce costs. And this didn't work out so well. No one really agreed to work together, but it was the idea that was really exciting, that there was this encouragement to work together to improve efficiency. And it's the rallying cry for this type of work is better, faster, cheaper. How do you get devices faster to the market, cheaper, and of better quality? And that was the idea behind this panel. And there was a lot of great discussion, because when you have a really novel device like a leadless pacemaker, you need to know what are these really rare failure mechanisms. How big a trial do you need to identify these rare failure mechanisms? And if we joined efforts, wouldn't that be better? And on the other end, what happens at the end of service of a leadless pacemaker? You just leave it and put in a new one, or do you extract it? And those are questions that are still outstanding as far as I know. And so that's a really long study. Do we need to wait 10 years to see what happens when these batteries fail? Well, again, that would be putting a lot of patients, that would be a huge opportunity cost for our patients. So that was the idea behind the panel. And it's the idea behind this group, the Medical Device Epidemiological Network, or MD-EpiNet. It's been a really exciting journey to work with this group, which is a public-private partnership between the FDA, some academic partners, and industry. Really all of the relevant industry has participated in this, both monetarily and with great ideas about how to deal with these problems. There's a jumble of words here: predictable and sustainable implementation of national cardiovascular registries, or the PASSION program. It's a work stream within MD-EpiNet in which the goal was to bring resources together among device manufacturers in a pre-competitive way to build an infrastructure so that it can be used for device surveillance across the life cycle of a device, from pre-market all the way through iterations of the device and even to obsolescence. My colleague at the FDA, Ben Eloff, gave this metaphor, which I think is really apt. If you build the stadium, you can play any sport there. You can play football there, you can play soccer there, but you have the stadium. And that's the idea. Build the infrastructure so that data can be collected in a reliable, robust way, and we can do better for our patients. We'll have more information. And one of the ways that this can be, one of the reasons why this is possible at all is because of the Unique Device Identifier Program. And the UDI program is one of those topics I could spend another hour talking about, but it's really exciting, and it allows us to, as the name implies, uniquely identify every device so that we can keep track of what's going on. It was really exciting. A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting at a table with all ICD lead manufacturers, every single one in the US, along with some academic partners and the FDA, having a true, honest discussion about how can we share resources, how can we make this work, how can we do a better job of surveilling our ICD leads so that we can achieve better, faster, cheaper. We'll see what happens. Stay tuned for that. And there are challenges. I don't want to minimize this. There are serious challenges. Challenges about data proprietariness, technical challenges of interoperability, challenges of governance. These are real challenges, and there's a lot of money at stake. But it can be done, and it's been done in different areas outside of EP, in peripheral vascular, in coronary intervention. There has been pre-competitive collaboration among industry partners to achieve this goal. It can be done, as my colleague once said, we have to fly the plane while we're building it. We have to learn as we go. We just have to start doing. Now, the holy grail is Registries as a randomized clinical trial platform. This has also been done. I'm sure many of you are aware, certainly my colleague Dr. Dole is aware of this. The Safe PCI for Women was a proof of concept study in which the cath PCI registry was used as a platform for randomization and for data collection. And the point of the study was to look at femoral versus radial access for PCI. Now, the results of the study got a lot of interest, but what got even more interest was the methods paper, which I don't know about you, I've written methods papers before. I never got any excitement about that. But my colleague Connie Hess did when she wrote the Safe PCI paper, methods paper, where she described this. And the PIs from this study will tell you that they achieved their, they finished the study under budget and ahead of schedule. So doing a clinical trial under budget and ahead of schedule those are not usually said in the same sentence. So it was a real proof that this could be done. And in fact, this group is going to replicate it in a study called Safe STEMI for Seniors. Not only are they using cath PCI as the platform, but they are embedding 3 IDE studies. So 3 different industry partners have decided to work together to fund the study together in order to study their device pre-market to submit to the FDA for approval. It's really exciting. I hope it goes well. It certainly would be a real revolution in the way devices can be studied. And there's no reason why we can't use other registries. doesn't have to be cath PCI, it doesn't have to be NCDR. There are lots of registries that could do this. And this was the idea behind the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is another group that I've been lucky to be a part of, was sort of the brainchild of Rob Califf, the idea that we could streamline the way clinical trials are done in this country. There are a lot of efficiencies to be had. And so randomized registry trials was one idea within that bigger idea. And we did a literature search. There's a lot of this kind of work going on in Europe, but also some that I've already mentioned in the US. We convened an expert panel. So we asked experts in the field, what did they feel were the big challenges here? What were the big successes? And we came up with a list of recommendations. And while the manuscript is still in preparation, the recommendations are available online if you're curious at the city website. Okay, that was a lot of information, a lot of background, a lot of big ideas, but we started with a patient. How does this at all matter for our patients? How does this matter for what you're going to do when you leave here and go start seeing patients? Well, our 65-year-old patient, if you recall, she has 2 non-functional RV leads. She now has an LV lead, and she has an RA lead, and she needs a new RV lead, and she needs a new generator. I mean, what do we do? What data do we turn to help us with this? Now, if you're going to counsel this patient, you'll talk about what her options are, and you'll come to some sort of decision about what to do for her. But think of all the data that you'll be collecting along the way. If you're a very conscientious provider, you might go to the MAUDE database, which is a voluntary reporting system for the FDA to report dysfunctional devices. You might put in some reports for the fractured RV lead. You probably won't, but you might. And if you put in a brand new device, you might enroll this patient in an IDE trial or a post-market surveillance study for the new leads or the new generator or both. As of right now, this being a Medicare patient, you're required to enter these data into the NCDR-ICD registry. That may change. The coverage determination has been reopened and may not be the case in the near future. And that has really interesting implications as well. But for now, you're required to enter these data. And then you're going to write a bunch of notes, and there's going to be an operative report of some kind, and all of that data goes into your electronic health record. And then there's going to be outcomes data 5-10 years from now when this patient is still enrolled in Medicare. You're going to have claims data. So there are a lot of data here, and my argument is that all of this is useful, all of this is important, and we just have to harness its power. We have to desalinate it so we can use it. So what does that mean in the real world? What does that mean? What should I do tomorrow? What can I do tomorrow? Well, the power of real world evidence is out there, and we can replicate the successes with that. Along with colleagues, I've demonstrated that a couple of times. There's lots of evidence in the literature that this can work. So we keep doing that locally, nationally, even globally. There's some efforts to combine this work globally to even greater improve efficiencies of device evaluation. I'd like to continue working with the FDA. As I mentioned, these are some of the hardest working, most conscientious, smartest. I often call them truth seekers. They really are trying to get it right. So collaborating with them has been really fantastic. And it's clear to me that they are absolutely thirsty to work with experts and with industry to get this right, to get the balance right. There have been some clinical successes, and we should duplicate those across EP and across cardiology and beyond. And we really need to think about engaging patients in this journey. We need to ask them what they think. What are their concerns? What do they believe to be the right balance? And then, through all of that work, we continuously refine the safety and innovation balance because it is a moving target. So a vision of the future for all of us is that innovation and safety are not in conflict. And I've probably said that enough times by now, but we can have them both. It just requires a little creativity. And this is the idea behind the National Evaluation, I'm forgetting what NEST stands for, but it's an idea, a system to have a national surveillance system for all devices that would sort of be the stadium for all devices across the nation to surveil them pre and post market, and again to improve efficiencies. This is sort of a nugget of an idea right now. They're just getting rolling, just getting off the ground, but certainly a place to collaborate to generate new ideas for this work. And we have to listen to patients. We need to make sure that we're reusing infrastructure, not duplicating infrastructure, and that real-world evidence, I believe, is the key to all of this, harnessing its power. So it's not an intersection after all. It's a two-lane road, and we just have to balance what we see as being important in regards to patient safety and achieving innovative medical devices, getting those to the world as quickly and as efficiently as possible. That's the end of my talk. I want to thank all the people that I've worked with over the past few years, especially my mentor, San Al-Khatib at Duke, and all of my collaborators, some of which actually are, I don't believe in this room, but here in Seattle, and my FDA colleagues who I respect so much for the work that they do. And then my Duke family, the EP faculty and the general cardiology faculty and fellows, my family, and of course to all of you for listening to all this information and for humoring me as I come here for a couple of days to meet all of you. So I really appreciate the chance to tell you about all this stuff that I'm so excited about. And I would love to answer questions if you have any.
That was wonderful. Well, I'll just talk about that. Was really great. I think you touched on a lot of topics, and I'm sure we're not the only ones in this room where what we do on a daily basis with patients has really been affected by what the companies do and what the FDA has been doing and now is innovating. We've certainly seen, I think, on our end, a lot of improvements. So let's see what questions other people have. Yes.
Thanks. That was a great talk. I have a question for you. You ended your talk saying you thought the FDA had the right balance of safety and innovation. And I've often heard, and you did as well, contrast it with the European system, which say they are much more sort of accepting of new technologies, getting them into the clinic. So if your final statement was correct and the FDA has found the right balance, that would suggest that there would be some evidence that over in Europe that their sort of adoption of new technologies was leading to some poor outcomes. And I often hear, oh yes, it's a much more permissive environment, but I've never actually heard anyone show any objective evidence that that has led to detrimental effects. So I just wondered if you were aware of it.
Well, that's a great point. And I want to take one step back and just clarify one thing. I think what I intended to say is that while we may not have achieved the right balance of safety and innovation now, I think we have the tools to get there. That I think we're on the right path with balancing pre and post market data collection and the use of real world evidence, that we can get to the right balance. So we may not have achieved it yet. But to your second point, which is really important, I mean, this is all about data. So where's the proof that there's problems in the European Union? And you're right. I'm not aware of any specific data showing significant patient harm, but certainly there have been devices that have been demonstrated to be safe, but that aren't effective and are used in Europe. And it's unclear, even if they're safe, why would we do things that are not effective? For example, renal artery denervation. Sort of a well-known story about a procedure that there was a lot of excitement, a lot of promise, and then, at least for now, we don't see a clear path forward for that intervention. And it was being done all over the world, really, and this evidence that when it was done the right way, that maybe it doesn't have great effect, has sort of stopped that in its tracks. So that's one example. And I think that again, the idea is maybe not that there's been a lot of harm, although I imagine there has been. Again, I'm not aware of the data, but I believe that the standard of safety and effectiveness is probably more appropriate, that we should be doing things that are safe and actually improve life.
I think that there are really challenges in Europe. Yes, it's the European Union, but it's a lot of different countries with a lot of different internal regulatory issues that each country has to battle, besides battling sort of what do we do. I know that recently, though, the device companies that do get CE marked in Europe, at least in our field, start registries, right away in Europe. So like the effortless registry for the sub-Q ICD, which required all of 55 patients to show safety before it was being used in Europe, now has this incredible registry. So I think there are efforts being done, but certainly they've been slow in coming.
Yeah, and it's a great point about the use of registries in Europe. It's perfectly permissible in the eyes of the FDA to use data generated in other countries to support an application in the US. So oftentimes these registries that are developed in Europe are then included as part of an application for device approval in the US. And as long as it's robust and well done, there's no reason that can't be leveraged for that purpose.
Other questions?
I guess that really was a great topic and a very nice dealing with this thorny and difficult issue. And I appreciate FDA's balancing act, but it seems to me like FDA gets mostly in trouble when there's harm. And certainly there's this low-level, or maybe not so low-level, arguments that is happening all the time about you're not approving things faster and Europe is ahead of us, and et cetera, et cetera. But from the FDA perspective and their PR perspective, I would think it would be a good thing that things were tested somewhere else before they actually make it to the U.S. and that there is this data to go on. And, I would imagine many FDA people are concerned globally, but the reality is their responsibility in the United States. Isn't it good that Europe's ahead of us in this respect?
It's convenient.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's convenient. There is, again, a lot of internal discussion. I mean, I'm not internal to FDA anymore, but I know there's a lot of internal discussion about this exact issue. And there are some ethical challenges with sort of outsourcing your early studies, and there is some guidance actually about that. I'm not intimately familiar with that guidance, but it's ethically thorny as well to do that outsourcing. And yes, it's good that there's no harm, that there's very, very rarely is there harm done. But perhaps you mentioned PR, and I'm not even sure the FDA has a PR department because I don't know. Yeah. But the idea of changing the culture, one of the things we found in our survey study of device patients is they basically think that devices are 100% safe. It has the FDA stamp of approval. Nothing could ever go wrong. I mean, that's a cultural problem. People, it's man-made, it's imperfect, and this is what I tell my patients all the time when we're dealing with a device failure, that we have to accept. If you want innovation, you have to accept some level of uncertainty in regard to safety. So, yes, it's good that it is so rare, but we have to deal with these ethical challenges. And I do think that these ideas about post-market surveillance in a really robust way can get us there, because we can see the signal early and we say, stop, okay, we know the rate of failure, this is too high, we have to take a step back. And that should be different depending on the device. A truly novel device where there is no alternative, that's different than the next ICD lead. So it's a convoluted answer to your question.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a good answer. There's really some very classic ethical studies of companies that have gone to not Europe to get data ahead of time and done things that were very questionable. And that is no longer accepted because it is not considered robust data, and there are ethical problems with that. But it seems like there's a continuing issue here with setting our standards so high for the good of our population, but the potential that it's always going to compromise other populations.
Absolutely. And actually the early feasibility guidance, which I mentioned but didn't really go into detail about, is trying to get at just this. How do we overcome these challenges? And it boils down to an idea that there should be very early collaboration between FDA and industry. Start talking early. What kind of study can we do in the US feasibly, affordably, to look at really novel devices in the earliest stages, and so there's a clear recognition of the problem, but no great solutions yet that I'm aware of.
Well, we had this side of the room, so we'll go to this side of the room. Thanks.
I'm interested if there are any existing systems outside the FDA that do this job better, or is this just a total new experience for the whole have achieved this?
Short answer, no, that I'm aware of. Long answer is that there are definitely different paradigms. A lot of countries honestly look to the FDA for approval of a device before they would entertain approval in their own countries, or they look to Europe for that. In cases, I'm not aware of something that is clearly demonstrated to be better in some overall measure of betterness. But for example, in Japan, the Japanese have some reason to believe that things work differently in Japanese biology compared with others, and they require their own studies for lots of devices and drugs. So you could argue that maybe that's better, that they really recognize these differences at the biological level. I don't know. I don't know how to assess that, but maybe that's better if you're looking at a biological level. But certainly things are harder to get approved there.
Catherine, did you have a question, sir?
Well, it was really more a comment on the real-world data issue. I mean, I think you presented a very convincing argument that real-world data, as you define it, is hugely powerful. But I think you have to keep in mind what you mean by real-world data is carefully designed registries where you're gathering data prospectively, where you define what data fields you're gathering and you're doing in the world, a cohort of data. I have to say, as a journal editor, the real world is having a code word for observation.
For junk, yeah.
Not a single study, poorly done research.
Yeah. I should never submit a paper to you.
I know, I annotate that word.
Yeah.
That is the real world. I understand that.
I see that as a great opportunity for an invited editorial review. Or just do it in your own journal.
That is.
That makes sense, and I think that the word is so appealing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's like anecdotal data is apparently real world data, and that's.
That is the real
Right,
world.
but that is the real world. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a waste basket of real world data. I think that is why this FDA guidance is super helpful, because they actually define what is real world data, what's acceptable. When it comes to what's done in the wild west of manuscript writing, then yes, it is a problematic term. But I also think that some of this junky data, if we had the right technical expertise or something, it could be used as good, robust, reliable data if we had a way of desalinating it. Forgive the metaphor, but I totally agree. It's we need to all be on the same page about what it means, and I think at least in regard to device regulation, the guidance from FDA is trying to get at that.
So one last question, and then I think we really do need to let people come up afterwards. But Kevin, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, quick. Thanks, that was a great talk. Do you think it's unrealistic to think that eventually the European regulatory bodies and the FDA could work together and with common standards, common definitions of real-world data, and be able to accumulate information much more quickly together?
Short answer, yes, I think that's impossible. But longer answer is that there is some collaboration going on globally. There's the MDTRF, the medical device, all these acronyms, I can't remember, but it's a global group that is trying to establish standards. They've started with some technical standards for data collection, and there's some agreement about definitions of endpoints. So trying to conduct global studies that would have an easier time making it through regulatory bodies in parallel. So we haven't quite gotten to the point where there's collaboration at the agency level, but at the point, coming up with ideas so that you can efficiently engage different regulatory bodies with the same data at the same time, that certainly there is ongoing efforts in that regard.
All right, well, I think we have to call it quits. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.